Hello, I'm Mary Mohebi, UFTI Equity in Transportation Initiative Lead. I'm really excited to share details about the upcoming webinar on equity in transportation. This webinar includes a February training session. For each webinar, I will lead a discussion with having two guest speakers who are well-known practitioners, and they will share their experiences and examples of addressing equity in their everyday practices. Their participation in the discussion help us to create a practical image of how to address equity as a practitioner in transportation field. For February training session, our guest speakers are Joy Goldman, who is the chair of TRB Committee on Accessible Transportation and Mobility, and also Larry Schooler, who is the director of Care Invest. Both well-known practitioners in the field who dedicated their professional life to creating equitable engagement systems for transportation projects. So the webinar topic itself is the topic of our era, and the COVID-19 pandemic, as we all know, showed how short-handed we are when it comes to addressing vulnerable population needs in the time of crisis. For instance, public transit system faced a serious financial distress due to steep decline in ridership. And the question is that were we ready for such crisis to be able to provide transit-dependent communities with their essential needs and access to basic resources like healthcare, food, and so on? And the answer is, unfortunately, no, we were not, and we have never been. And so the COVID-19 was one of the many, many wake-up calls we had in the past. We learned a lot, and we learned that we need to be aware of the needs and concern of communities we serve to be able to provide them with services during crises like this global pandemic or 9/11 or many, many more that we had during the history of American cities. And here is why understanding equity is significant, specifically for transportation, which is all about access, which is all about accessing resources and opportunities and human rights. For that reason, we put together a content that meets the need of transportation practitioners and people in academia. And we all were equipped to customize this course in the way that suits your organization needs and priorities. So please feel free to reach out and discuss it further. So for February 17th training session, which is in an hour and a half session, including a 10 to 15 minute guest speaker section, we will define equity in transportation and identify different dimensions of equity when it comes to transportation projects. And we try to understand that why it's important to address equity and uplift equity through transportation projects using a few case studies. And we get familiar with available resources that we have and how to toolkits that are out there that we can use for our projects. And then we will have practices and some tests to see what an equitable process means exactly in transportation project. And the agenda will be first welcoming an introduction for sure, and then we will talk about health and social equity in context of transportation. Then we will have the first guest speaker section, and then we will talk about manifestation of equity in different phases of transportation projects. And then we will talk about how we can work on capacity building through equitable community outreach processes. We will have introduction to available resources and principles and nationwide initiatives. And then we will have the second guest speaker section. And at the end, we will have interactive exercises to identify when and how to invite communities to the table. When we are working on a transportation project, we will have 5 different case studies for that exercise. And then at the end, I will have an overview of the webinar, second webinar actually, and then we will have a brief discussion on what we learned during the February webinar. So for interactive discussion exercise, actually, we will test a few methods and tools to measure transportation projects' commitment to equity. The diagram that you're seeing is from the briefing book for transportation planning process, which is a 2015 actually update from FHWA and FTA, and it shows different phases in transportation planning. For this interactive exercise, we will focus more on budget and public involvement. But for the second webinar, we will extensively talk about every phase of transportation planning, and we will talk about how we can measure transportation project commitment to equity in every phase. So the guest speakers, both of them, they will talk about the perception of equity first, and then they will talk about what is the mindful practices, mindful planning for transportation projects, and why it should be actually central practice. So for mindful planning, help us to understand what is the power dynamics when we are working with transportation agencies. And we have so many different stakeholders working with us, like from nonprofit, from a grassroots organization. And it also helps us to understand what is the community, what type of resources they have, what type of values they have that we should be aware of, with what language we should speak to them, and what is the history of the community. And it helps us actually to understand that what that community needs and what type of concern they have that we should consider as the main question to be answered during the transportation planning process. And then it also helps us to understand what type of limitation we have and what are the priorities that we should address. And then at the end, they will talk about investment in equity in transportation and what does it mean exactly. They will have an overview of federal guidance, like Title V, ADA guidance in NEPA, but it will be just an overview. And for the second webinar in March, we will talk more about those federal guidance and how we can use those in our projects, and what type of knowledge that we should have to use them for a local project, which is a different scale than the federal guidance scale. And then the second thing that they will talk about when they are addressing investment in equity in transportation, they will talk about how to develop an approach, actually, which is equitable when we are talking about community engagement. So they will talk about how we can build capacity within the community, and then what type of action we need to take. And at the end, they will talk about issues and concerns that need to be addressed. So we're very excited. It was a very brief overview of what we are going to experience together on February 17. And we are very excited to see you all on February 17. So please feel free to send any question you have about the content of the webinar using the email address in this slide. We have an exciting and interactive session, and after the webinar, you will receive an email summarizing what we learned and the result of the exercise. So see you all on February 17, and please don't forget to register for March. In March, we mainly focus on equitable community engagement for transportation project, and how you as engineer, planner, scholar, and overall a practitioner in the planning field can play a powerful role to create an inclusive transportation system that considers needs of communities in an equitable way. Thank you very much. See you in February.